solutions. My name is Rob Werner. I am the State Director for the League of Conservation Voters in New Hampshire. And before we get started into the meat of the program, what I'm going to do is turn it over to our track sponsor, Connor, from Eversource, to say a few words of welcome.
Thanks, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. Connor Jennings. I'm the Community Relations Specialist for Eversource in the western part of the state. Very grateful to open this session for the Clean Energy Track, and we're really proud to be the track sponsor this year. This is a summit that I've been involved with since I started with the company in 2019, so it's great to be back here in person in 2022. As I mentioned yesterday, Eversource seeks to be a catalyst for cost-effective clean energy in New England, while providing safe, reliable service to all of our customers. We're currently studying the Inflation Reduction Act, recently signed into law by President Biden, to identify specific ways it can support investment in offshore wind, solar, energy storage, and other innovative clean energy solutions. The Biden administration has shown strong support for the clean energy future, and this act is a very promising step forward. Of course, it's only one piece of a broader picture. Clean energy solutions will require a flexible and resilient transmission system, so new sources of energy can smoothly and reliably be interconnected to the grid. We'll work every day to ensure a strong transmission system, but additional upgrades will be needed. In creating this bright future, we must make every dollar go as far as possible, limiting the cost impacts on residents and businesses here in New Hampshire. The support of the Inflation Reduction Act will help. Energy efficiency programs like Eversource's nation-leading offerings have an important place in the equation as well. Even in a future powered by clean energy, we can help homes and businesses manage their energy use and reduce their bills. Eversource looks forward to working with all interested parties, federal, state, and local, to build a new energy future that benefits everyone. It's a huge challenge, but also a wonderful opportunity. On that note, I'll turn it back to Rob so we can move forward to what promises to be a great session. Thank you.
Thanks, Connor. So to set a little bit of context, so again, we're going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed a short time ago, and also the Farm Bill, which is reauthorized every 5 years. That's going to start next year. So on the Inflation Reduction Act, so there's $369 billion of investment that covers a large amount of ground. There are energy efficiency measures for individuals. There's additional electric vehicle tax credits for folks to buy EVs, both new and used. There's a whole menu of very helpful things. A lot of it is based on tax credit approach. But there's also a significant amount of attention and dollars that go to agriculture, conservation programs, helping farmers become ever more part of the solution in terms of reducing emissions, but doing so in a way that promotes economic opportunity for them. And so we're going to be talking a bit about that. I will also say, as I said yesterday, I think one of the significant things about the Inflation Reduction Act, not only for our country, but on the global stage, it provides an opportunity to bring something very significant, real, that's going to be set for a 10-year period. And that's very important as well. But on the international stage, the fact that we can bring something to the COP27 conference that's going to be kicking off in Egypt in November is highly significant, because I think it really reestablishes American leadership. Last year at COP26, it's true to say that the Biden administration was putting forward proposals, and certainly in contrast to the previous 4 years, but I think there was still a fair amount of skepticism in the international community. Where is the United States really leading on this? And I think with this piece of legislation, that's going to be made ever more real. On the business side, and the fact that this proposal, this legislation, sets forth a period of 10 years where these tax credits are going to be in effect, That's very important as well. Because, we've struggled over the last number of years with various programs at various times in terms of tax credits for renewable energy that lasted maybe 3 years or 5 years. This is providing a much more certainty. And what does the private sector want more than anything else? Certainty, predictability, to be able to plan and make investments. That's important because the $369 billion is going to leverage many more billions of dollars in private investment. So to have that time horizon of 10 years is very significant. So we have a great panel here today. People that really are involved in various aspects of agriculture, climate. We have Britt Lundgren, who's the Senior Director of Sustainability and Government Affairs at Lactalis US Yogurt, which includes the brands Stonyfield, Siggy's, and Commonwealth. We have Allan Reetz, who's the Director of Public and Government Affairs at the Hanover Co-op Food Stores, which is the nation's second largest consumer food cooperative. And then we have Julie Davidson, who's the CEO of Southshire Farms, a product of the Regenerative Food Network, and board president of NOFA, New Hampshire. So what we're going to do actually now is to have a video from our Congresswoman from this district, 2nd District, Annie Kuster. Annie was hopefully, originally we had conceived that she would be able to join us today, at least for a short time. But there's too many votes going on right now today in Congress for her to do that. So she kindly provided a video welcome for us. So we'd like to play that now.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry I'm unable to be with you in Keene today for the Radically Rural Summit that brings attention to and addresses issues that are at top of mind to so many Granite Staters. To everyone who helped make this important event a reality, thank you for your work and your advocacy for the rural communities throughout the Granite State. I want to take a moment to talk about climate solutions and climate action. As we know, rural communities are not immune to the impacts of climate change. Right here in Cheshire County, we've seen devastating floods and extreme weather events that impact our state's infrastructure and public safety. As a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, as well as the House Agriculture Committee, tackling climate change while supporting New Hampshire farmers has been a top priority for me in Congress. Just last month, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act. This piece of legislation is the single largest action to fight climate change and support renewable clean energy our country has ever seen. Alongside this historic bill, I've been pushed to energize our state with green energy through the groundbreaking use of biomass, hydropower, wind, and solar. I'm proud to have introduced the Veteran and Beginning Farmers Assistance Act. This program would reauthorize the applied technology transfer for rural areas, which prepares our farmers to deal with extreme weather and help fight climate change. I also introduced the Biomass Utilization Act to provide tax incentives for residential and commercial properties that utilize biomass energy. This will keep abundant and diverse sources of energy in our state while supporting the local foresters that operate sustainably. Rural areas deserve robust support and attention from our federal government, and I'm proud to champion our rural communities and economy through my work in Congress. As we begin to draft the once every 5-year Farm Bill, I will look for opportunities to invest in our local communities and develop strong, resilient local food networks that are a win-win for our economy, our climate, and our health. Thank you to the organizers and attendees gathered here in Keene for the Radically Rural Summit for all that you do for our state. With folks like you taking action, I know our future will be bright. If there's any way that my office can be of assistance to your organizations, your businesses, or your initiatives in New Hampshire, please never hesitate to reach out. We're here for you. Best wishes again on a terrific conversation and an important event.
Thank you, Congresswoman Kuster. You know, we're blessed, actually. She's well placed in the Congress because she is both on the Agriculture Committee and Commerce and Energy Committee. As a matter of fact, in New England, we have some very good champions for some of the things that we think need to be priorities in this space, and certainly in the Farm Bill as we move ahead with Congresswoman Pingree in Maine and Congressman McGovern in Massachusetts. So what I'll do now is turn it over to Britt. She's going to be talking about some of the provisions that are in the Inflation Reduction Act that are really important for this area.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. Yeah, I get the fun job of telling you all about the different things that are both in the Inflation Reduction Act, but also some other recent actions from USDA that I think are really relevant. You really can't talk about this upcoming Farm Bill without talking about either the Inflation Reduction Act or the USDA Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities program, because both of those things are really setting the stage. So starting with the Inflation Reduction Act, you know, it's been mentioned that this is the largest federal legislation that we've ever had on climate change. And it's pretty exciting in that regard. And it includes substantial provisions to support farmers and forest landowners in improving conservation on their land with a focus on addressing climate change. And it mostly does that through existing programs and providing additional funding and also additional direction for those programs that are in the Farm Bill. And so there's approximately $20 billion in there that is expanding funding for programs like EQIP, CSP, the RCPP, I never get this one right, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program. So EQIP and CSP are really designed to cost share with farmers. When farmers identify they want to make conservation improvements on their farm, EQIP and CSP will pay for a portion of those activities, usually like anywhere from 50 to 70% of the cost of those practices. And they're chronically oversubscribed programs. And so this new funding is a real opportunity for USDA to go out and serve a lot more producers and help them identify what are the practices that they can put in place on their own farms that will help them address climate change. The Regional Conservation Partnership Program is interesting because it really sets up this goal of having public-private partnerships where you have NGOs or companies applying to USDA to work with a group of producers and then channeling that money again through EQIP. So it still relies on that EQIP structure, but it also involves a partnership where those partners are delivering technical assistance to the farms and helping them figure out what their opportunity is on conservation. And RCPP got a really big boost in funding in the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think in the last Farm Bill, it was funded at $300 million for the course of the entire Farm Bill. It's now been given $4 billion to spend out over 4 years. So just, I think like one of the things that when I think about all of this money that's coming through the Inflation Reduction Act, it's really exciting. It's also a really big challenge to all of us to step up and actually get this money spent in a responsible way to make sure that we are all collectively advancing projects that are going to really move the needle on climate change and be beneficial to the producers that are engaged in the projects. So the bill also contains money for technical assistance for farms, which is much needed in order to deliver all of these programs. And it contains funding for improving the way we quantify greenhouse gas benefits on farms, which is also much needed. And then it has a big chunk, like $13 billion for renewable energy on farms. So there's a big opportunity here to partner with producers to help them put renewable, whether that's solar or wind in on their farm. At Stonyfield, where I work, we're looking at this really closely because we have a goal of having all of the dairies that supply our milk be powered by renewable energy by 2025, which is starting to feel really soon. So we're really pleased that the cost share for REAP was also increased to 50% in this bill, because that, I think, can make a big difference to producers when they're looking at, like, do they want to make the capital investment to do this right now? And I think with what's happening with electric rates around the region, it's also a really powerful incentive to producers to come to the table. There's also one other important provision that I want to mention, and that is a debt relief provision. So this was a bill that Congress actually passed earlier, maybe last year they passed it, and then it was overturned. It was initially passed as a bill that was debt relief for Black farmers who have historically been discriminated against by USDA for decades. And that was overturned in the courts. And so they've gone back, they've restructured the language. It will still provide debt relief to Black farmers and other farmers so that it was, was able to, address the legal challenges that came up the first time. So I think that's an important step in the direction of having more equity in the Farm Bill. Certainly we have a lot more work to do on that topic in this upcoming Farm Bill, but really glad to see that happening in the Inflation Reduction Act. So at the same time that we have this massive investment coming from the IRA, we also have USDA launching the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities program. And this is something that USDA is doing under their discretionary spending authority with the Commodity Credit Corporation. And if you're old enough, if I say the phrase government cheese, that's a product of the Commodity Credit Corporation as well, right? It's historically been used by the agency to buy commodities as like a price support measure. But USDA has gotten rather creative in how they use those dollars, and this is not the first administration to pursue this, but this administration said, okay, let's use these dollars towards creating climate smart commodities. And so they put out a request for proposals. They said they were going to fund $1 billion in proposals where organizations would come together with producers to, propose how they were going to generate these streams of climate smart commodities. And they received $18 billion worth of proposals across 450 applications, which is really pretty exciting because I think it signals the volume of interest that farmers have in engaging and becoming part of the climate solution. So USDA just announced the recipients of that funding a couple of weeks ago, and they upped the amount that they're giving out. So they're giving out $2.8 billion in grants through this program now to a wide array of producers. I mean, you have everyone from the National Corn Growers Association and National Pork Producers getting grants to organizations like Open Team, which is really focused on developing technologies that will enable farms anywhere of any size to improve soil health and track the benefits that they create. That's a project that we're really closely engaged with at Stonyfield. So there's a real wide array of projects that are funded across basically all production types in the US. And again, it's another really significant investment in supporting farms in adopting climate smart practices and also measuring what the benefits are when farmers do adopt these practices. And so going into the Farm Bill, which is supposed to be a 2023 bill, as a climate advocate, part of me, I don't want to sound lazy, but part of me is like, check, like we got this additional funding. We have these huge opportunities on the table. We almost don't have to have this fight in the upcoming Farm Bill. It doesn't mean our work is done. There's still a lot that has to happen in this bill and a lot of other opportunities to advance things like equity and address hunger. And, there are important things that we can do in this Farm Bill. But from a climate perspective, the table is set really well. Now, a lot will depend on what happens in the midterm elections, especially in terms of control of the House. The Republicans have been signaling that they are not interested in having a big focus on climate change in the 2023 Farm Bill. And even just this week, G.T. Thompson, who is the the ranking Republican on the House Agriculture Committee, so the presumed chair if the Republicans take control of the House, he was quoted as saying that he doesn't feel beholden to the provisions in the IRA in terms of the amount of money that's been put into these conservation programs, or the fact that the funding is directed to be spent solely on climate change. So you see a lot of messaging coming from Republicans in the House that signals that if they do take control of the House, we are going to have substantial work to do to keep a focus on climate in the Farm Bill. I think we also have, it's incumbent that if we're going to be pushing this kind of money out the door through USDA, that USDA be delivering the technical assistance that farms need to actually understand what their opportunities are on a farm-by-farm basis to address climate change. And so I think strengthening technical assistance is going to be the focus of a lot of organizations in this upcoming Farm Bill. And there's one other point I was going to make. I know I'm going on here. Oh, and then I just want to say that, like, in the spirit of advancing equity in this bill, I think there's a big opportunity to advance more equitable access to land, because we see that that's a big barrier to Black and Indigenous and other farmers of color in getting into farming and succeeding in farming is land ownership. And so I think that there's going to be some interesting proposals in that regard, and that will be a space to watch. And I know Julie is going to talk more about the organic opportunities in the bill, so I'm not going to cover that right now, but thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. So informative, and really appreciate the interest of everyone here. I work with a food cooperative, as Rob pointed out. We're a large food cooperative, and I was speaking to someone last evening at Connect, and when I was sharing that I do public and government affairs, she said, "Wait, a food co-op, you do that?" And as food cooperatives, whether you're large, like an $80 million business like the Hanover Co-op, or the incredible cooperative here with Monadnock, it is the responsibility of food co-ops to step up and share information and lead, because we represent our community. And I am grateful to see each one of you here and those joining us online, and also grateful for Eversource's support of this information. I have a bit of a show and tell, if you will. When we hear the important information that Britt shared, there's also this urge sometimes to say, okay, so how do I get involved? Where do I begin? What rabbit hole can I go down? And I'm a big fan of rabbit holes, because I've discovered that's where you find the rabbits. And I'm going to give you a lead on where to go and where I spend part of my time. Whether you're a member of a food cooperative, or you're shopping at a CSA, or you dedicate time and resources to farm stands and farmers markets, you are part of a community food web, not just a food chain, but a web. So this is critical, because we need more than just dedicated consumers. We vote with our dollars. That's important. We also have to be informed consumers and speak up to ensure the sustainability of that food web we count on, the Monadnock Food Co-op counts on, which leads me to a story of resiliency. And that story of resiliency starts with the pandemic. Food co-ops like ours and all across the country were more resilient because we already had that built-in local food web. When the pandemic hit, supply chains were crumbling, produce is rotting in the field, milk is getting dumped. Cooperatives like ours had already planned the summer harvest with local farmers. We have the cell phone numbers of local livestock producers. Now at our co-op, we sell some commodity meat. We also sell a lot of local. And so when you can call up a farmer, or you can be very nimble, that's what food cooperatives, CSAs, which skyrocketed with their interest in the pandemic, really delivered to all of us. So how do we maintain that? So there's a bit of a show and tell here. Education, if you're familiar with cooperatives, we have 7 cooperative principles. Principle number 5 is education, training, and information. So here's the show and tell part. There's some information on the back table with some sheets that look a lot like this. If you don't want to take away paper, there's a QR code on the top. And if you're joining us online, we're going to be putting a link to this information on the screen that you can grab. So here's what you'll see within this information, and I'm just going to walk through the depth of the detail briefly. So this will sort of hopefully pique your interest in going down the line. So it links to some Farm Bill advocacy resources. These are currently housed on the Hanover Co-op's webpage. We have so much great information out there and great organizations such as American Farmland Trust. If you click on the links that I've just indicated here, you will find a full view and deep dive on resources, including a book called The Farm Bill, A Citizen's Guide, which Rob has a copy of. If you look at the back, I've got 5 of my favorite books sort of in quasi-virtual mode back there. I took a photo of the binders. So Farm Bill Resource Guide, American Farmland Trust, what a resource. Farms Under Threat, more information from American Farmland Trust. Take a look at that. The state of the state when it comes to farms under threats. There's links directly to how New Hampshire stands up. Our cooperative is on dual borders. We have a store in White River Junction, Vermont. So you can look at what some of the issues are and how our states score. There's the Farm Bill 201 Draft Toolkit, which I love. Thank you to our friends at the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. This is fantastic information. There are so many links. It's a great rabbit hole. Please make sure to go down it. Marker bills. Rob, you and I were spent some time together at New Hampshire Food Alliance's statewide gathering in May, and the topic of marker bills comes up. What's a marker bill? Here's the information so you can understand it. And in brief, it is this idea of putting a concept out there legislatively to see what interest it gains. And so that's really helpful to understand. And I want to pause for a minute and say, you know, I'm not just dumping information at you and say, hey, go educate yourself. This is the idea of saying, I understand the language now, or at least I understand the context. And I can start to say, I can't advocate on all of it, but what are the key points to me? You know, there's 12 titles in the Farm Bill. Not all of them relate to our small farms, the way something like conservation might. But there's rural development, it's a title. You know, so those are sorts of things where you can say, hey, that's a real passion for me. The Grassroots Guide to Federal Farm and Food Programs, an overview of grant programs. EQIP was mentioned a couple of times. G.T. Thompson, representative from Pennsylvania, who can be critical of certain aspects of the funding that Britt shared. He said the other day at a hearing, EQIP is the workhorse of the Farm Bill. Small farms, medium farms, large farms all over the country have needs that are served in the things that Britt shared with you, as well as what we hope to maintain in the Farm Bill. And it's not just maintaining in the Farm Bill. There's aspects of the Farm Bill that relate to discretionary spending and mandatory spending. Critical difference, because we can have 50 million or 3 billion put on something. If it's discretionary spending, the jury's still out on whether the pocketbook ever gets opened. Mandatory spending is as it's described. This is a great one. There's some USDA one link on there, the Farmer's Guide to Farm Bill Programs. On the back, although this looks pretty dense, and again, you'll link to this, so you'll get direct access to it. But they break it down by programs of the Farm Service Agency, Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Risk Management Agency. This was some good clarity. Farm Bill 101, what you need to know about its reauthorization and why it matters. This is actually just a white paper from a law firm out of DC. It's a good read, and it's there and available to you. We have a Farm Bill primer there, and as a bonus, an acronym guide. So when we say EQIP and CSP and other things, it's important. So there are some books there, and I certainly encourage you to get into the stream of content. And there's local sources as well. Certainly cornucopia.org, organic organization, has a great newsletter. Stonyfield has their Get Involved link. Regenerative Food Network has some important information. And so once you start to live in these streams and get in on the information in the newsletters, you quickly get up to speed. And then, as Representative Kuster said, reach out to her office. And sometimes you can reach out with specifics to simply say, I'm concerned about, or I appreciate the Congresswoman's support of. And I'm going to share a story very briefly that Britt certainly knows a great deal about, and that was related to GMO legislation in the state of Vermont, when Vermont really looked to be very clear about the labeling on it. And then, as many of you know, that was kicked down to the federal level because during the Obama administration, they said, we kind of need to take a look at this at a broad scale. And I was down in DC on an issue, and that topic came up. And as you know, the feds dealt with it, but I don't think very well. And as one of the ag staffers said to us in a group conversation, said, you know, when it came to the GMO labeling thing, the phones just weren't ringing. And, you know, legislators need cover sometime, or sometimes they just need to hear. So step up, step out, and I'll close with this idea of speaking up. David Zuckerman, as many of you know, is an organic farmer and former and perhaps future lieutenant governor of the state of Vermont. Said once, democracy is like staying on a good diet or an exercise plan. You have to make time for it, a few hours, a few times, every single week. So you're a partner in the local food system, and that's critical. And I thank you for, again, your interest thus far.
Thank you. I'm going to just provide an overview of the Northeast Organic Farming Association and some of the work we've been doing to support and move forward some of these initiatives. But I also wanted to speak to some of the wins first that we see in the Inflation Reduction Act. The Office of Management and Budget Analysis has provided an assessment of the IRA Act, and the fourth National Climate Assessment shows that without substantial and substantiated mitigation and adaptation efforts, climate change continues to create new risks and challenges to human health, safety, quality of life, and the economy. And they have assessed that it could cost us an additional $25 billion to $128 billion annually to our economy if we don't mitigate climate change. So it's good that we have these steps going forward, both in renewable energy, but I'm also excited to see that agriculture is recognized and lifted up in this act as a natural climate solution. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Northeast Organic Farming Association, the organization has been around for 50 years. It started here in the Northeast. Its founder was actually Samuel Kamen, who was the founder of Stonyfield Organic. And we just celebrated our 50-year anniversary, and that's where sort of the birth of the certified organic program started. And organic farming inherently is a natural climate solution. So, and it's focused on soil health, but also the social community that supports farming as well. So we're also interested in supporting workers' rights, equity. And so there are several chapters throughout the Northeast. Each state has a chapter. And so there's a chapter in New Hampshire, New York, and all of the chapters have been working on creating what they call the 2023 Farm Bill campaign, and have highlighted some principles that we are advocating for. And I'm not sure if this made it into the handout list below, but we can send this information to the producers so you can get it out. And you can also visit the nofanewyork.org website to sign up and get involved and to receive email updates. But the main principles are to invest in and protect the integrity of the organic and agroecological practices as a core solution to our climate and biological crisis. Technology will be helpful, particularly around renewable energy, but we also can't forget that part of this climate crisis is biological in nature. Ensure fair treatment and just livelihood for farmers working throughout the food and farming system. Invest in rural communities. Increase fairness and resilience of local and regional supply chains, and break up consolidation in agriculture. Centers on racial justice across all programs and repairs past and ongoing racialized harm. Britt spoke earlier about some provisions that are helping to amend that. Promotes sovereignty for disadvantaged communities and ensures nutrition security for all. Eliminates use of toxic substances on farmland and our food system while supporting a just transition for farms. And as Allan had mentioned, there are some key marker bills that help guide the Farm Bill. Some of the ones that we've highlighted are the Agricultural Resilient Act, Farm to School Act, Food from Family Farms Act, those are Justice for Black Farmers Act, and Strengthening Local Processing Act are a few. We work with national partners to implement, although locally some of our partners are sitting right here at the table, but as Allan pointed out, the American Farmland Trust, Heal Food Alliance Platform for Real Food, the National Organic Coalition, the National Sustainable Agricultural Coalition. Those are some other great resources for the Farm Bill. And a couple of things I just wanted to point to in my work on a daily basis. I speak with and work with lots of producers throughout the region, and I think they're reflective of many farms throughout rural America, and that's what we're here today as Radically Rural Conference to talk about rural America. And there is an opportunity to improve the economies in our rural America by investing in the many massive small farms that exist throughout the region. And that is the one area I think we need to keep our nose to the grindstone and advocating and pushing for. Many of these programs are great and will provide funding to, help turn the tide, particularly for a lot of the large farms in the Midwest, where some of these climate smart commodities will provide funding to help them transition to practices that are known to improve soil health. And that's the crux of what we're looking at, improving soil health, particularly soil health in terms of the Soil Health Institute has just listed at least 3 high-level measures, and that's improving organics, carbon, or organic matter in the soil, carbon and mineralization in the soil, and also aggregate, the ability of the soil to aggregate and that hold its structure. And so all of this provides a lot of valuable services to society. And so in terms of ecosystem services and the value that that provides in risk mitigation for flood, we're seeing a lot of extreme weather patterns. And so some of these programs are designed to help build the soil infrastructure to mitigate the impacts that we're seeing and feeling from climate change. So that's important, but we need to make them accessible to the many small farms. And a lot of the structure of these programs, when you get into the mechanics of these bills, it's hard to do that. And so an example of that would be, let's say, the EQIP program. If you're a farmer and operating on a small scale, the payment is not really an incentive to go through the paperwork and that sort of thing. So I think what small farmers are seeing and needing in our region, and a lot of them are implementing these practices already, is they need the infrastructure and they need the market access to support farm viability. And so I would like to see some opportunities where there is discretionary funding to be aimed at initiatives and pilots and demonstration for our regions. Rural America, there's a lot of creativity that's happening in our communities, but we need an infusion of capital to help get this started. And that includes meat processing infrastructure, that includes local dairy processing infrastructure, that includes distribution networks. We have an opportunity now to make them electric, and to infuse renewable energy into these networks. And I guess I'd like to close on a point that Allan, you had brought up in your speech. You were talking about a food web, and I think we need to look at rebuilding not a food chain. That chain failed us dramatically during COVID, and we need to look at building regional food system webs. And where there is flexibility in this funding, I think that's what we need to be advocating for to support our rural communities in redeveloping these regional mid-tier programs. And the level of entry is a barrier right now. So if you look at the food supply chain loan program, that is geared specifically to larger food supply chains. The barrier to entry is that there's a $30,000 feasibility study. So if we can remove some of these barriers to entry to make, to introduce more competition as well into our food supply system, because my one fear with this is that the funding is flowing through the same channels, and we need to rebuild the architecture if we want different results. And so I think that's where we need to look for those opportunities in the Farm Bill so that we can truly transform our food system and begin to think in terms of different ways and not end up having the effect with what is a great intention be the further consolidation of the food industry, which is part of the issue here. So I think there are some opportunities to do that. I think we're on the right track. And there are many ways and places to get involved, and a lot of good key projects in our region to get involved with. So thank you.
That's fine. So actually, we have this slide up that tells you about the various titles of the Farm Bill. And actually, to put it in a little bit of context, the current Farm Bill, 2018 to 2022, we're talking about $867 billion of expenditure. And about 75% of that is devoted to nutrition programs. Probably the most recognizable is something like SNAP. But there still leaves a lot of dollars available for other things. But I'm going to turn it back over to you, and you can talk a little bit about maybe some of the titles. You know, one thing I will say, and maybe as a marker idea, there is no climate title in the Farm Bill. And it's something I think we'd like to see. It probably is not in the offing in this current political context. But as with any marker idea, you got to put it out there. You got to fight for it. You have to make the case for it. And perhaps the way things are going and the investments that are being made, maybe someday we'll have a different situation there. But I don't see it for the short term. But again, it's something I think is worth looking at.
There's, I guess, one other thing I'd like to draw your attention to. So while the IRA and the Farm Bill are progressing forward in parallel, there's another movement to evaluate or create a value for ecosystem services that farm steward landowners provide. And so there has been, the federal or the White House has released the Natural Capital Accounting, a strategy to develop statistics for environmental economic decisions. So I just draw your attention to that as well if you haven't seen it or heard about it. But what they're attempting to do is measure natural capital in an official U.S. economic status. The emission of nature from a national balance sheet leads to erosion of current and future economic opportunities, as they cite in that document that has been released. So there's a lot of activity happening in that space right now, so it's something to keep an eye on and pay attention to. Ecosystem services, if you're not familiar, are the relative contribution of natural capital to human well-being. It provides recreation, it provides food, it provides risk mitigation to flood and those sort of things. But I just like to, I guess, leave it at that in closing.
So just to add on to the title topic, Title VII, research and the extension service, and specifically, if you're looking for something to start out with, integrated pest management. So critical to organic farms, critical to farms who are not certified organic but follow an IPM practice. I was speaking to farmer Pooh Sprague of Edgewater Farm out of Plainfield, New Hampshire earlier this year. And he lamented the lack of research and the lack of information that American farmers have at their disposal. And even though he is, quote unquote, a conventional farm or whatever you might call it, you know, Pooh said, I really worry about my organic friends. He's a strawberry grower, for instance, in the spring. And he says, the rootstock and the problems with berries, we have rootstock that's coming from some older providers, and they're aging out. There's also some anomalies that are happening, and very few dollars are being dedicated to this. He also said when it comes to integrated pest practices and the biologicals, he says frequently we're relying on information that's coming out of Europe via Quebec, and there's very little field study to say what works, what doesn't, how long is the shelf life of some of these things. Do we bother putting it on? If I got a fungus or I got some other issue I'm trying to solve as a non-organic farmer, he wants to stay with the IPM practices. But sometimes he has to go to the tools at his disposal. And as he said, I really worry about my organic friends. So dollars on research, the United States needs to catch up.
Thanks all. I had a couple of questions. I'm going to turn it over to audience both here and virtually for Q&A. I guess a question that I have is maybe in part a philosophical one. I mean, obviously, in our political system, the large farms, Midwestern farms, there's a lot of influence that those policymakers, those members of Congress have in shaping any farm bill. That certainly has been the experience. How is it, or what strategies or what hopes do you have for this next farm bill and as we move along, that the farm bill can be used more as a vehicle than it has in the past to build up smaller farms, build resilience, improve our food system in a way that provides more nutritious food for more people? How do you see that shaking out?
That's a big question, and I'll just offer up a couple of pieces. One is to first just make sure that the farm bill isn't in the way of farmers making good choices. And I think especially about crop insurance. Crop insurance is so important, especially as farming becomes riskier and riskier with the weather swings that we're having with climate change. And yet crop insurance is really designed to work best for large producers who grow a handful of things and don't have a lot of complexity in their operation, you know, corn growers, soybean growers. And when you think about what a farm needs to do to become more resilient to climate change and to help mitigate climate change, really it involves bringing a lot more complexity into their operation. It involves having more things in their crop rotation. It involves using cover crops. And just those two things make it like infinitely harder to sign up for crop insurance, no matter what size your farm is. So if we can start to fix crop insurance, which is one of the titles of the Farm Bill, if we can start to fix the way crop insurance functions so that it doesn't discriminate against smaller producers and more diversified operations, we're creating a ground in which those kinds of farms have much better risk management tools at their disposal, and they have an opportunity to thrive. And then the other thing that Julie mentioned, I think is so important, is having the resources in place for market development and infrastructure. And I think a great example of that is if you look at grain production here in the Northeast. We see some burgeoning pockets of grain production and organic grain production happening in northern Maine and Aroostook County. I love the work that Maine Grains is doing to bring that stuff to market. And then we see some happening in Vermont as well. And those farms just face tremendous barriers in terms of having the right infrastructure to dry their grain, to process their grain, and to get that grain to market. It's not that this is a bad region to produce those things, it's that we haven't invested in that infrastructure in this region. So having money available to help fill in the gaps in the supply chain, I think could be really important to allow diversification, especially here in the Northeast.
Thanks. And to add to that diversification, imagine if we could rebuild our local seed banks, focus on species that are adapted to our climates. One of the things we've lost with industrial agriculture is the local knowledge pool. And so Britt had mentioned earlier, the technical assistance will be an important aspect of that. I'd like to see some of that driving peer-to-peer learning, farmer knowledge sharing, and bringing that back to the Midwest. If you've been to Iowa or any of the Midwestern states, agriculture does look very different here in the Northeast. So I think the transition will look very different for them, and it will need to happen in a context that makes sense and supports their viability as a farm. Same here in the Northeast as well. So we have a lot of dairy producers right now who are struggling with the costs and the market conditions right now, and so supporting their transition as well as if they choose to exit dairy farming, what options are we providing? And so I think there are some opportunities for that, and there are some interesting ideas and innovations that have been funded through the climate commodity grant program that Britt had just mentioned. One of them I was reading about is RIPE 100. It comes from Virginia Tech, and what they're proposing to do is pay farmers $100 an acre for certain conservation practices that are climate friendly. And so they estimate that implementing these stewardship practices are around $67 per acre, but the carbon markets are only paying $17 right now. So they're proposing this as a layer on top of existing payment structures. So I think we need to get creative in how we're using this funds, and also it needs to be unique to our region, location, and needs. So I don't think a one-size-fits-all approach is going to solve the issue. And unfortunately, that's how a lot of our national programs are structured. So I think seeing and allocating more funding for innovation that is region-specific is going to be important to fighting climate change in agriculture.
Thank you, and a very important point you just ended on there with on the local level. Part of my job is to sit through and listen online to a lot of congressional hearings at the subcommittee level, and I've waded through probably a half a dozen over the past few weeks. But what I heard from Representative Thompson and Representative Allan, both Republicans, Allan is out of Georgia, was decisions and flexibility at the local level. There is common ground. And as another ag staffer said to me, he said, there's a lot of bipartisanship when it comes to agriculture. Generally, when it comes to finalizing bills, they agree on the dotting of I's and the crossing of T's. On the crop insurance issue, that's an important point that you've made. We talked earlier about the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP. As I understand the program, and I'm still learning, farmers enroll portions of their acreage or all of their acreage on a contract basis, 10 to 15 years, let's say. Well, those contracts come to an end. So there's that opportunity for them to either re-enroll or not enroll it. And then crop insurance can cover, unfortunately, some risky farming practices. And as Britt pointed out, the idea of cover cropping and diversification is very, very important. So I think, to go back to your question, Rob, about what are some of the things that can be done even though we're talking about grand scale agriculture, those communities across the country that produce agriculture on a grand scale need food too. I mean, that sounds silly to say, but when the pandemic hit, Feeding America, the largest food distribution service in the United States, was trucking food into regions that produce most of our food, because they grow a lot of corn, they grow a lot of soybeans, but try to find a fresh local onion. And so I think that there is there is common ground to say every region of the country needs a food web. And I'm going to close on a stark story that I heard on a USDA call that had people from all over the country. I was on a call, they were into the question and answer period, and a gentleman on the Zoom event said, I'm from East Texas. We're about an hour and a half just east of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, top 10 market in the United States. In the early months of the pandemic, our grocery stores could not get consistent deliveries of food. Those grocery stores would only see a tractor trailer show up every 2 to 3 weeks. And when it showed up, it was mostly snack food and candy. That's a problem. And those representatives from across the region can understand that because their constituents felt it and lived it.
So both of these bills, the one that's been passed, the one that's forthcoming, are BMOS. And there's so much information in them, so many provisions. It's very complicated. You've touched on it a bit, and we talked a bit about it yesterday too in the session around infrastructure, in terms of really how do people learn about these opportunities, and in this context, how do farmers really take advantage of it? What's the marketing strategy? I was reminded when talking with somebody earlier today, I saw a poll a few months ago that indicated that only about 30% of the American public even realized that the infrastructure bill had been passed. And, we live in an era of such bifurcated information, and so much is thrown to us every day, more than ever before. So I guess in some way that's perhaps understandable. But how do you break through with this information? What are the marketing mechanisms that are most effective to make sure that, as you pointed out, Britt, that these programs are effective, that the money is spent well? Because if it's not, that has a political effect that's negative if these things don't work well.
Who wants to go first on that?
I think you just need to make it worth their while. I mean, I got an email just today from a farmer who's been working really hard on his farm here in New Hampshire all season long, growing his vegetables. And he said, I don't think we're gaining. There are 2 farms in my region that I know are closing right now because they can't make ends meet. They can't sell their products. So at the end of the day, I think if you want farmer involvement, they need to know that they can sell their food. Their food's not going to waste. The effort that they're putting in, the services that they're providing as land stewards are valued. And I'm not sure we're sending that message to our farmers right now. So I think the more we can make these programs accessible and bring them into the architecture when we're building them so that they can function well for them will be a key piece of that. And I think, having sessions like this, but the work that so many organizations are doing throughout our regions are important, and supporting that, the technical assistance and outreach so that those technical assistant providers can go out onto the farm and meet the farmers where they're at and listen and look at what's happening on their unique farm. So sometimes the practices may or may not be applicable, and you need to see the land topography and a variety of other factors that will impact the success of certain practices on those farms. So I think that's one place to start.
It also comes down not only to that important communication. Boy, the failure of communication is the assumption that it's taken place. We put information out there, but making it connect, making it useful. Julie, great point in terms of being that supportive voice. The consumer's voice is what secures the consumer's choice. And I think one of the things that I'll go back to a few of the comments that I made is that when there is an issue that's very important to you, organizations such as NOFA New Hampshire to become a member, New England Farmers Union offers a membership level $15 for consumers who are, have a co-op membership. That's an organization that's been talking about climate change for years, and gender equity and farm access, et cetera. I want to go to one other point when it comes to communication. Language is critically important when it comes to advocating for specific things, and that's where your homework comes in. When it came to the origin of livestock issue and trying to close that loophole and pushing for that, at one point I received information, it was through Farmers Union, that said, this is exactly the language that you have to send. And it was just 2 sentences, because you were basically saying you are supporting specific language that was going to go into the final bill, or not bill, but perhaps at the advocacy level of closing that, because it was that precise. You couldn't add, well, let me just summarize. No, we have heard from so many people that they support this language. And fortunately, that is one success we can certainly look back on in what has been overall a pretty good year.
I think when it comes to reaching farmers, I think that we need to have a much bigger societal investment in extension services, again, whether that's through universities or the conservation districts or through NRCS. But I think that we need to just view that as an important investment of our resources to get out and provide individual farmers with the information about how they can sign up for these programs and why these programs matter to them. Because in a farmer's day-to-day, they have so many decisions to make. They have so many things that they're confronted with. The long-term conservation planning doesn't bubble up into the top until they have time to rest, or until it becomes a priority that they can't ignore. So the more that we can have people who are proactively reaching out and providing that information, I think the better positioned we're going to be.
Great. Thanks so much. So we're going to open it up for questions here and online. I wonder, do we have any questions online at this point? Okay. Does anybody have questions here?
So I've read a lot and have started to look at, I'm a sun harvester, have been for many years, and I'm wondering about agrivoltaics. There seems to be a lot of activity in France and a few other places that I read about, but I'm wondering about the potential here and whether that's something that we can take advantage of in terms of some of these funds that you're talking about. Don't know if anyone has a comment on that.
Yeah, we've been looking pretty closely at what it would take to bring renewable electricity to the 34 dairies that are part of Stonyfield's direct supply program. And we've learned a lot. One of the things that we have learned is that the health of the grid really factors in here. So a lot of our farms are still in locations where they have single phase power, which makes their farm a challenging location to try and put solar in, especially if they want to net meter. I'm hopeful that battery technology is going to come along and come down in price so that there could be storage solutions that allow these farms to adopt renewables in the next decade. But it is an obstacle. I think, the idea that you could mix solar panels in with grazing animals is appealing to some farms, but it's still not wide. It's not like something that you can drive down the road and see, and farmers like to be able to see something before they adopt it. So I think we need to start to identify where are the good locations where we can put this in, show that it doesn't happen at a detriment to the agricultural land base, that we're still maintaining that soil available for agricultural production, and then start bringing farms to see it happening, really have a concerted outreach effort around it so that we can demonstrate that it's something that they could do too. But the Inflation Reduction Act does have important tax relief for investment in solar, and so it extends the tax credit. And while there are lots of farms that maybe don't have an appetite for a tax credit, there's an opportunity to partner with investors who do have that appetite. And now that we have some predictability in that, it's much easier to plan and identify investors who want to partner with farms and take advantage of that tax credit. So we hope there's opportunity there.
Thanks for pointing out that part about the grid. And, you know, just as to pivot off that and a comment for, you know, Eversource as an important partner in all of this, it reminds me of a dairy that I know up in our region, not in the Eversource marketplace, but they kept, simply through their processing, kept blowing transformers or whatever it was out at the pole. Or it was some aspect and it was very difficult to get the upgrade necessary. It took a long time. And so therefore it is important, and I know that certainly Eversource, I've seen you know, they walk the walk, and you know, and that's important, that once it comes down to farms being able to make the upgrades or be ready, that expediency from the utilities perspective is really what helps it, because uncertainty and getting ducks lined up, it's like you gotta move, because the farmer has limited time and limited windows.
And I would just add, there's an opportunity to provide renewable energy on both our distribution and aggregation points that supports farmers. So again, infrastructure, and there are a lot of bottlenecks both in distribution locally on regional supply chains, mid-tier supply chains, as well as cold storage. We have a lot of bottlenecks, and so if there could be investment in using renewable energy to power and build those as we're rebuilding our regional infrastructure, that would be helpful. For example, we recently purchased through a USDA-funded grant an electric refrigerated vehicle that we'll be using to distribute food product throughout the region. But we also need the charging stations available as well. So if we can reimagine our regional food system, food supply web, what it would look like, where are these points of distribution and aggregation, where do they need to be, I think that would be just a great mapping exercise actually to do and fund for our region, or in rural country or rural communities across the country as well.
I just wanted to make a comment about the grid too before I turn it over. So backing up a little bit and looking at the bigger picture, in order to get to this 40% emission reduction that the IRA is leading to, we're gonna have to electrify everything. Heat pumps, more charging stations, EVs. The Biden administration is talking about building 30 gigawatts of offshore wind all up and down the East Coast. So when you're adding all of this new capacity, new way of doing things, it's important very important that we make the investments in grid modernization, which the infrastructure bill at least had some good start with. But you know, it really has to work hand in glove in terms of this type of activity and this large investment in the grid as we move forward. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to meet the promise of all this legislation that has been passed and the direction in which we need to go. But we have a question online, I believe.
I just want to
go
follow
ahead.
up.
Follow up, John, and then we'll go there.
To say that we did put a 90 kilowatt system on a farm and created a group net metered, and that is owned by investors, and ultimately those farmers will have the opportunity to buy it in 6 years. And that system came online in 1220. And that's the second of those kinds of systems we developed here in this region.
Okay, we do have a question online, which is, how do we hold the funding groups, parentheses, government groups, accountable to provide the funds to the farms in need, especially small farms? From Kyle Jacoby.
your voice matters, as I've emphasized a few times. There's interest in terms of spending the dollars. The smaller farms get a smaller share. They get, less attention. But I've, in my experience, have not seen a concerted effort to divert funding per se. It's just that it gets gobbled up pretty quickly when things are oversubscribed. And I think the funding that Britt reflected on in terms of increases to programs, we have got to help those farms earn their place in line. And I think Representative Kuster's office is an important link to that. So the holding them accountable, I would conclude my remark by saying, when it comes to discretionary funding, you've got to fight and you've got to stand up very, very hard, especially because in the last Farm Bill, in one of the early drafts of it, some of the former language that at least provided good funding to say must spend at least X amount of the, 1 billion must spend at least 50 million or 500 million of the allotted funding. Some of the language got changed in the draft to read can spend no more than 1 billion. 0 is no more than 1 billion. So language matters, attention matters, speaking up matters.
I think when you think about the structure of USDA and NRCS, they have their staff size at NRCS has shrunk over the past 5-6 years in a pretty substantial way, and those folks who are in the field giving out EQIP contracts or CSP contracts for NRCS, they have a certain number of hours in the day. They have a certain number of dollars to spend. And the more large dollar value contracts they give out, the fewer hours it takes them to get that money out the door and do their job. And so there's kind of this incentive baked in the way the agency is structured and staffed to serve the larger farmers first and have these larger contracts first. And I think that that is something that we need to continually point to and ask the agency to use their discretionary authority to increase the amount of technical assistance staff they have in the field so that they can get more contracts out to smaller farmers. I also think there's an interesting opportunity with the Regional Conservation Partnership Program it just probably would take a Farm Bill maneuver to get Congress to remove the matching requirement for groups that are working with small and underserved producers. So if you have to have a 1-for-1 match for spending and you want a $50 million grant, that's really hard to obtain if you're a small organization like NOFA or you're working with underserved producers. If we could remove that match requirement for organizations that are serving those smaller farms, I think that would allow us to really use that program much more effectively.
Yeah, thanks, Britt. That's a good point. And I would say that this is an issue of scale. So the program's not scaled to benefit the many small producers that do exist. And so, I think we need to keep pushing for new and innovative programs that meet the needs and interests for our smaller farms, which are going to be really important as we continue to feel the impacts of climate change in producing food for our local communities. So I think we need to propose and innovate and take advantage of where there is discretionary funding to propose new ideas and innovations that will help bring together small farmers, help them build that scale on regional levels and support, again, regional food system. I'm making a plug for that strongly here today. So.
And I think the questioner brings up a really important point, and that is farmers have very little time. Britt has pointed out the need to only so many hours in the day. In the hearings that I've been monitoring, time and again, witnesses who were in front of these committees said, it takes too long to get the funding that we've been promised. If I could get it within 12 months, I'd be happy. I'm waiting on funds that were dedicated 2 years ago. I can't wait any longer. And so the small producers, as you pointed out, Britt, are ones that have the quieter voice. Well, we need to stand with those local farmers beside them and lead with them from the front.
We have a follow-up question from Kyle, and then I'll get to this one over here. Many small farms have limited resource and time to go through the funding process. I think we just addressed some of that. Any suggestions on ways we can support farms through the application process?
It's a great question from Kyle, and it does bring to mind something that I'd heard from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture when it came to funding applications. And so this is not necessarily a comparison between our two states, but it does relate to the federal programs. And I look forward to the insights from my fellow panelists, is that when block grant funding can be provided and streamline of applications can happen, we're more likely to get the dollars out into the field as they're required. One of my colleagues and collaborators up through the Vermont Agency of Agriculture said, you know, if I could have one thing out of the Build Back Better Act when it was sort of the phase 2 of pandemic funding, we'd love to see more block grants. We understand the needs on the ground, local decision making. We can help those farmers get through that grant application, as opposed to saying, oh, there's a grant out there and you got 2 weeks before the applications are due. It doesn't help anybody.
I think you said it all.
Hi. I was wondering if you are aware of any efforts to mitigate the emissions from transportation from farm to store, besides obviously like shopping locally, but for example, like larger scale electric vehicles or something?
Important question. I think we've touched on a few of those points where is the grid? And as somebody pointed out, the electric vehicles, and do we have the grid capacity? My mind was immediately going to the Hanover Co-op food stores thinking, okay, could we put a charging station near the loading dock for that truck when it's unloading to tap in so it can recharge? Because certainly with the electric vehicles, I spent a week in one recently, and it was so much of our life all of a sudden was planned around where can we, because it was purely electric, where can we find a port that's available? So that's where my head went initially. Aggregation is at least not necessarily the electric element of it, but working with the New Hampshire Food Alliance and folks like Julie, we have put forth a proposal to the state of New Hampshire to use some of their funding from the federal recovery dollars that they have available for food hub support. Food hub, fewer miles from the farm to an aggregation, fewer trucks traveling, helps everybody. Doesn't quite get to the pure electrification issue, but it's a great question.
And the USDA department does have a grant program that can fund electric vehicles. So if we could just advocate for more funding to support the expansion of that, that would help as well. So it would help both regional and national distribution networks access that funding so they can expand it. It's a good point.
Yeah, from the manufacturing perspective at Stonyfield, we've been looking at how do we reduce vehicle emissions from transporting our product, which we mostly make here in New Hampshire, to all of the places that we sell it all around the country. And there's lots of different layers to that. It starts with the packaging for the products and how can you stack the boxes or the pallets of product in the truck in a way that maximizes the use of the space in the truck without risking smushing the product, because that does happen. And wasted product sort of defeats the purpose when it comes to trying to reduce emissions from these things, and what's in that box or what's in that pallet in terms of materials. How do you reduce emissions from that? But we're also aware and supporting efforts. There's a state agreement right now to increase the amount of electric vehicles that are sold. And so certain states have signed on to this. I'm sure, Rob, you can speak to this much better than I can. But I know that in Vermont, for example, they're looking at putting this into effect, and they have specific targets for larger vehicles as well as passenger vehicles. So hopefully that will start to bring more into the mix.
I have one question. I'll cover that, John. Some of this has to do with charging stations and electric vehicles, but I'm on the Keynes and Energy and Climate Committee, and I imagine there are groups like ours all around the country that are studying ways that our communities can become more energy efficient and how that relates to climate change as well. But one of the things that is often missing in the plans to accomplish these is the contribution from farms and forestry in our communities. And how can the benefits and or negatives of those two industries be incorporated into the examination of energy from a community standpoint? I mean, these committees have the ear of their municipal governments, and if they can start to say, you need more, you need to encourage more farming, or you need to encourage different types of farming, you need to encourage or discourage defoliation in your community, etc. If we had some way of inventorying that somehow, so that we can go back to our community leaders and say, look, we're providing a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but we're also taking a lot out over here. We're measuring one, but we're not taking into account the other. Are there any efforts around the country that would help these kinds of arguments?
I don't know that any examples are coming to mind, but my first thought is to start with the farmers in your community and really engage in dialogue with them to find out what their needs are, because you might find some surprising ideas about where they would start in addressing this. And I think having the farmers be at the table and creating the solutions will help them be a lot more invested in implementing those solutions and advocating for those solutions with their neighbors. So I think it makes for a much stronger foundation if you can ask them.
It's an interesting point, and you're absolutely right, Britt. That is the place to start. I have the pleasure of working and knowing many farmers quite well. Been at a lot of farm tables. There is a hesitancy on the part of some farmers when it comes to their operation, if they suddenly feel that they are going to be hit with yet another cost. The competitive stance in the marketplace for small farmers is precarious. Everything we've spoken about here today and large corporate agriculture, they suffer first. They take the biggest hit on. They are interested in becoming more sustainable. So the conversation and the willingness is there. So how you approach it is critical. And that's true not just in the Northeast, but it's true across the country. So I think tempering the conversation, helping them understand where you want to get to together. They're willing partners. They'll be at the table. If it's a row crop farmer, choose something maybe in the January and February when you want to have that conversation. And when it's a dairy producer or a livestock farmer, be flexible with your scheduling.
And I guess I would just add, looking at the contract language and making sure that it's flexible. If farmers are going to lose the flexibilities they need on their land, or are concerned that they are going to get locked into a long-term contract when they can't be sure they're going to be here from season to season. That could be a barrier for entry for certain programs, especially like community solar farm programs. So, and they're sharing that risk across all the farms. So if you can sort of somehow have a risk mitigation strategy to cushion that, to make that entry easier, I think that could be a way to look at that. I think some of that is happening in conversations we're having in terms of creating ecological asset trust and involving farmers in that, in getting payments to them on the land, but enrolling their land. That's sort of a scary process. And so we're looking at language and contract flexibilities that can help.
An important addendum. Many farmers are leasing land. So you're not just dealing with the farmer. And the lease land issue is important to them, land access. And if you are a landholder and are interested in leasing your land, be flexible with your farmer. Too many times folks just want to see hay on it. Sometimes they have to do other things. So that flexibility and understanding of their constraints is critical at the outset.
We're coming up on time, so are there any additional questions online or here? Why don't we go over here?
I just want to make a quick comment on back to the Farm Bill and the negotiations. I belong to a few organizations that talk a lot about a lot of Republicans behind closed doors in Congress acknowledge the climate problem more than they're prepared to on the outside. So in lobbying and noting the risks that we're seeing, whether it's in California or elsewhere, to our ability to feed ourselves, I think there's more opportunity than you realize, those that lobby on behalf of farming with Republicans. And I'd like you to keep that in mind.
I know there was some discussion earlier about the potential role of solar. I'm curious if any of you have any perspective on the potential role of appropriately sized methane or biodigesters for small rural farms.
Oh, if I had $1 for every time someone said to me, oh, there's this technology in Europe and it works really great on small farms. Like, but where is it, right? It's a source of great frustration to me. But that said, I know that Strauss Creamery, which is out in Petaluma, California, has been trialing these digesters that are essentially like giant rubber bladders. And they also use this technology in less developed countries where people are using wood for cooking. So they use it to replace wood and they create gas that they use for cooking. It's a really interesting option, and I'm really curious to see how it goes for Strauss with this. I don't know. I worry about here in northern New England whether something like that is going to make it through the winter. Which they don't have out in Petaluma. But so far, we haven't seen great options for small-scale methane generation on farms. It's not to say it doesn't exist and that it's not coming, but I wish it would get here faster.
Any last online questions? Any last questions here in the room? Seeing none. Thanks for joining us. I want to thank Allan and Julie and Britt for joining us here today. And I want to thank our volunteers, Peter and John, for helping us out today. And this has been a fairly interesting discussion. There's so much potential here. But again, we have to make sure that our farming community can take advantage of all these wonderful opportunities for progress, and that how that fits into the larger picture of what we need to do to meet the challenge of climate change, but do so in a way that's going to create opportunities for us. This can be a hopeful time in terms of what we need to do. We just need to make it so. So thank you very much for joining us.